Hello, everyone. We are going to go ahead and get started today. Thank you all for joining us. Welcome. My name is Kristen Fleischman-Brewer. I'm the Director of Public Engagement at the Pulitzer Arts Foundation here in St. Louis, Missouri. We are here today to discuss racist monuments in our backyard. The panel is part of a week-long program in collaboration with Monument Lab, the Philadelphia-based public art and history studio that we've been collaborating with at the Pulitzer now for 2 years. So this is a culmination of our work this week in celebrating the research that's happened with a team of local researchers and collaborators, where we've been looking at regional power and visual culture. So I'm here really just to provide context, and then I'll get out of the way. So a brief summary of our last 2 years to bring us to date. In the summer of 2018, we invited Monument Lab to organize a project as a counterpoint to the Pulitzer's exhibition, Striking Power, Iconoclasm in Ancient Egypt, which brought together objects that were intentionally destroyed for religious or political purposes across 4,000 years of history. Though the exhibition was historic in nature, it underscored how visual culture facilitates narratives of power, asking viewers to look deeper at cultural memory and the creation and destruction of monuments, cultural sites, and memorials across time and place. Many St. Louisans will work is that when we do historical projects, we like to try to figure out ways to make them relevant to now through our contemporary lens. So Monument Lab proposed a project, and what they wanted to ask the public by gathering publicly sourced inventories of St. Louis of memories was a question, which was, how would you map the monuments of St. Louis? So how did we answer that question? Last summer, a team of local researchers in Monument Lab worked from field offices at the Pulitzer, and we invited the public to participate in answering this question by submitting their response in the form of a hand-drawn map. In addition to being at the Pulitzer, they attended 46 events, engaged people from 141 zip codes, and the result was an atlas of about 750 maps that marked both traditional and unofficial sites of memory, whether they're monuments, different sites, memorials, or landmarks that were existing, potential, historic, or erased. The goal of the project were to explore the relationship between St. Louis's residents and the city's inherited symbols as a means to critically explore, represent, and update the iconography of St. Louis. So the last 2 years, the collaboration with Monument Lab has transformed from a public residency and community organizing project to social science evaluation and data sharing. And at the same time, as we all know, the local contexts have drastically shifted. The project now sits within the context of 2 pandemics. Monuments have become a focal point of the movement for equity and anti-racism work. These actions of taking down monuments, whether systematically or forcibly, demonstrate care and energize the work of dismantling the racist systems that we live with every day. In the last 2 months in St. Louis, we've seen tremendous change. The Christopher Columbus statue was removed in Tower Grove Park, and the workhouse was voted to be closed. These are tremendous and interconnected actions in the work of many people. As we plan to release our week of programming and our 2 years of residency research with you all, we were asked to center the voices of Indigenous leaders and the energies around the removals, which brings us to today's program. Before we jump in, I hope you will join us for other programming this week. Everything can be found on the Pulitzer and Monument Lab's website. You can also download the entire data set of all 750 maps that were created by the public and download a digital copy of the map. You can also place an order for a printed map, and we will ship you one for free later this summer. So thank you for joining us. I'm pleased to welcome moderator Lindsey Manshack, research manager at the Kathryn M Center for American Indian Studies at Washington University in St. Louis, and PhD candidate of Indigenous Health at the University of North Dakota. She will be introducing our panelists and leading our discussion today. Thank you, Lindsey, and thank you, panelists Alyssa Lazzeroni and Marvin-Alonzo Greer. Thanks.
Thank you, Kristen. So I just want to say good afternoon to everyone and to those tuning in. So today our discussion will go into some local St. Louis efforts around historical monuments. Before we get started, it's important to understand the history that has brought people to the land which St. Louis now resides. A land acknowledgement is a statement that seeks to show respect, recognition, and gratitude to Indigenous people and who call this land their home. Today, St. Louis rests on ancestral lands of the Osage Nation, the Illini Confederacy, the Missouri, the Oat. We acknowledge the people who resided here for generations and recognize that the spirit of these Indigenous people permeates this land. As St. Louis community members, we will continue to build upon our relations with First Nations of the state of Missouri. I want to start off by acknowledging that Americans and local community members have been peacefully advocating for the removal of racist statues within their communities for decades. We've been sitting at the tables and we've been sharing our stories and the histories of these racist monuments, hoping that we would see some of them removed peacefully and as an act of solidarity for the local community. And recently, following the murder of George Floyd, America saw an uprising against racism and police brutality. And the coronavirus has allowed many people to work from home. And so we saw a burst of people coming to the streets for the Black Lives Matter movement and to advocate for anti-racist policies. So we saw an increase in efforts targeting anti-racism, which includes what we'll be speaking about today regarding the removal of racist statues. And one of those specific statues we'll be talking about is the Christopher Columbus statue that was removed from Tower Grove Park here in St. Louis. I was on that commission and represented an American Indian voice, but also a researcher's voice and an objective voice for how and what the park should do to remove the statue, or if they should keep the statue. And I'll share a little bit of insight into what went into that process. We'll also talk more specifically about the legacy of Christopher Columbus. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists. So Alyssa Lazzeroni is a licensed master social worker and certified lactation counselor, originally from San Antonio, Texas. She's worked in several nonprofits in St. Louis City County and St. Charles County, practicing psychotherapy with children, youth, and families. She co-founded the St. Louis Doula Project, which is a grassroots interdisciplinary nonprofit made up of doulas and social work or public health professionals who are passionate about increasing accessibility of doula services for folks who are incarcerated and transitioning from incarceration. She is a Chicana small business owner of Rooted Life LLC, and she offers services that support individuals and organizations through trauma-informed consulting, coaching, and individualized mindfulness and wellness sessions. She's passionate about social justice and is an active member connecting art, healing, and empowerment. She's worked on several projects around Native American issues and reclaiming ancestral land in St. Louis and Missouri. And we also have Marvin-Alonzo Greer. He's the Education and Visitor Experience Lead at the Missouri Historical Society's Soldiers Memorial Military Museum. He develops K-12 programming, community engagement strategies, and a robust public program initiative highlighting the accomplishments of St. Louisans and their connections to the military. Community outreach and public programs under his leadership promote veterans from various communities, often left out of historical narratives, including African American, LGBTQIA, Latinx, women, American Indian, Asian, and immigrant communities. In his personal time, he practices interpretive skills by going to underserved communities and bringing history to life through neighborhood tours, living histories, and museum theater performances. He's a native from Pasadena, California, and grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, where he graduated from Morehouse College with a BA in history and a minor in African American studies. So welcome, Marvin and Alyssa. Thank you both for being with us today. Can you share a little bit more about yourselves and maybe a little bit about your local St. Louis efforts on statues?
Alyssa, I'll let you go first.
Okay. So I have been working and researching with Lindsey and other folks in the community around the Christopher Columbus statue and also with the Natives Count program through the Booter Center, and helped to put on a healing circle recently since the statue was taken down for Natives in the community. That was a very powerful event, and really solidified some of the ideas that I've been thinking about as far as what work needs to be done.
And so I haven't done that much work within the St. Louis community when it comes to statues, but part of my work when I lived in Atlanta was contextualizing statues and understanding those histories. Oftentimes when memorials and statues were put up, they were kind of only showing the best side of a person or a very small snapshot of that person. And so working with communities to better understand who those individuals were and is what I've been doing since I've been in the museum field. So that's probably about 20 years now. And then also since I've gotten here to St. Louis, working with different community partners to help educate individuals, to help highlight those histories and help tell the whole story of individuals. Because oftentimes the stories of marginalized communities are not highlighted, and the people that we lift up and literally put on pedestals are people who committed heinous crimes. And so really helping both our white counterparts and people of color from all different backgrounds to better understand the histories of both trauma and survival that both our white counterparts and people of color have sustained throughout the years, and why those monuments further to perpetuate some of that historical trauma.
So thank you both for being here. This is exciting. I wanted to see, Marvin, if you could talk a little bit more specifically about Christopher Columbus and just Christopher Columbus statues nationally and locally.
The Columbus statue and Columbus Day in general is a fascinating story, because the myth is that Columbus, I know I was taught this as a child, and I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and so I was told that Columbus discovered America, and he was this great American hero. And the closest that Christopher Columbus ever came to what's the United States is landing in what's now Puerto Rico. So technically he landed in America, but not. But the U.S. did not acquire Puerto Rico until the 1890s with the Spanish-American War. Columbus was an Italian sailor and navigator. He was commissioned by Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand of Spain in the 1400s to try to find a trading route to the east, and he stumbled upon what's now the Caribbean, landing in pretty much. He landed on almost every island in the Bahamas, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Jamaica, and he encountered many indigenous people, who most of whom were very friendly and tried to trade with them. And the crimes that that Columbus ordered and allowed his men to commit on these islands did not land Columbus in the best light, not only amongst the indigenous people there, but also amongst the Spaniards who came and the other sailors who came with him. He made a total of 4 voyages. After the 3rd voyage, he was arrested by his men and taken back to Spain to be put up on charges because for brutality towards the indigenous people there. There was rampant sexual assaults and murders that took place. Not only just the spreading of disease, which was most likely done unintentionally, but the punishment that Columbus ordered to be doled out to men, women, and children for slight offenses for the indigenous communities were heinous. Once the United States kind of was formed, mainly towards the mid 19th century, Columbus statues start kind of popping up throughout the United States. And here in St. Louis was no different. In the mid 1900s, Henry Shaw, famous St. Louisan, wanted to build a statue to someone to quote, a good man for humanity. Now, if you don't know the history of Columbus and all you know that he quote unquote discovered America and was this great Spanish explorer that landed and planted the flag that created the United States, I could kind of see how you might want to build a statue to someone like that. But again, knowing your history is deeply important. Columbus was a very successful explorer. He made some discoveries for Spain. Now people were already living there, so you can't really discover someone else's house or home. But he stumbled upon the Caribbean. That's an accomplishment for him because he found that. But is he really someone that we should be highlighting? Is he really the person that we should be lauding and putting up on a pedestal? I would ask anyone listening or anyone listening in the future, if someone assaulted your mother, your grandmother, your child, would you want them to be put up on a pedestal? Who is the predator that you would allow to that you would think should have a statue of? And if you can't think of anyone, then that's probably the answer that you would want to think about when it comes to the Columbus statue. Later on in history, Columbus Day and Christopher Columbus statues were thought of being kind of showing Italian pride. And while I do think that it's important to know where you come from, and have pride in your community, we should also think about the individuals who we want to highlight as model citizens for our community. There are people throughout almost every background, every culture and ethnic group who could be looked on as being model citizens and individuals who did amazing things. But unfortunately, Christopher Columbus is just not one of those individuals. And then the myth that he discovered America, he has nothing to do with the United States or United States history for the most part, outside of our fellow countrymen who live in Puerto Rico. And then his history there, again, was not a stellar one.
Yeah, it is very much can you hear me appropriately? Like, yes. Am I going now? Okay. What you said about a statue can be of someone who is in some ways successful and in other ways had committed some heinous crimes, but we still put the statue up to show that person's successes. And then individuals who were impacted from the heinous crimes have to look at the statue for a long period of time and watch others admire it. And specifically here in St. Louis, seeing the Columbus statue up for so long, going to the park, that was sort of what was happening with my own personal reflections on the statue. So thank you for bringing that up. I'm going to move over to Alyssa and ask about specifically where does your passion for accurate history stem?
So when I think about this question, it comes from a lot of places. I'm Mexican Italian, and so the idea of having blood of both colonized and colonizer is really important, and knowing our history is important to how we think of ourselves. In social work, we do genograms where we go through and we look at relationships within families and how that has affected the current client in front of us. And so in many cases, there's so much intergenerational trauma that has been perpetrated since, my family came over to the US from Mexico in 1912, and some of those generational patterns have still been happening as recently as my mother's and my own history. And so when we think about how are we going to make changes, we need to know the accurate truth about the history, so that way we can know the scope of what needs to be changed. And there's like, I think one of my favorite history projects that I did in undergrad was having to look through my Texas history school book and see how often women were mentioned, how often people of color were mentioned, and it was almost non-existent. And then like people like Santa Anna are seen as the bad guy, even though like Mexico had already abolished slavery. And so those are the things that we need to know about as we continue to make change in our country.
Marvin, do you have anything to add to that?
I do not, other than Alyssa's comments on Santa Anna and the Mexican-American War and the Mexican War and the Texas Revolution. Texas rebelled primarily because they wanted their right to own people. The Mexican government had abolished slavery. Even Ulysses Grant, a former president of the United States, who served during the Mexican War, said it was one of the largest unjust land grabs in American history. He was ashamed that the U.S. did what they did. And so, yeah, it's how we remember our history, and that, unfortunately, we as Americans are not very good at understanding those histories. And again, to better, I think, to Alyssa's point, it's important if both mental health and history go hand in hand, because if you don't know your own personal history, you don't know the history of your country and where you came from, whether you were born here in the United States or born elsewhere, you're not going to be able to understand yourself and some of the traumas that your parents or grandparents or even you are suffering from, or some of the actions that you do.
Yeah, I'll say what drives it for me is my experience as a Native person brought up in Missouri. So I've been living in Missouri since I was 7 years old, and my only connection when I moved here was the racist mascot that my school had at the school. And so exactly like what you said, if I was also learning accurate history in the history curriculum, I would be more able to have my cultural identity present whenever I shared that with other people, but mostly people saw me just as the school mascot. So that as I've gotten older and looked more into accurate history, it's helped so much in my cultural identity, which therefore has influenced my mental health and my physical health. And that's one reason I advocate for accurate history in standard curriculum across the state, but 27 states actually do not mention any Native Americans in their K through 12 curriculum. And that is from data from Illuminative and their Native Education for All program. So I'm just going to move on and ask a follow-up question to Marvin. Are there controversial statues in St. Louis right now? And if so, can you talk about a couple of those?
So, yes, there are. I will first start off by, there's one there's a few in Forrest Park. The first one is the Frank Blair Jr. statue. It talks about his great patriotism to the Union, and Frank Blair was a Missouri Unionist during the American Civil War. He was a loyal Union officer, and he believed that Missouri should stay in the Union. Prior to the war, though, he believed that Missouri, and even after the war, he believed that Missouri was for white men and free white men and white men only. He said the territories should be reserved for free white men or surrendered to the slaves and their masters. He also continued by saying free blacks had no place in the country, which could not be maintained. Those who fled to the north are the most unwelcomed visitors. The strong repugnance of the free white labor to be yoked with the Negro refugee breeds an enmity between the races, which must end in the expulsion of the latter. Pretty much meaning Black people should not associate with white people. After the war, he ran against, he was the vice presidential candidate running against, at the time, Ulysses Grant, who was running for president. And that was one of the most racist political campaigns in American history. And we've gone through some pretty bad ones. And this is known as being one of the most racist. In 1868, he also, he said about African Americans, if Ulysses Grant was elected, he said the semi-barbarous race of Blacks who are worshipers of fetishes and polygamists, and that if Grant was elected, it would subject pretty much white women to the lusts of African American men. And he's saying this from the campaign as a campaign speech. And we have a statue up to him. Again, he was a Union officer, served loyally, helped win the war. But does his loyalty to the country outweigh the white supremacy that he espoused? When it comes to our Indigenous brothers and sisters, Thomas Hart Benton is another man who loved some manifest destiny. Senator Thomas Hart Benton is probably one of the most famous St. Louisans. Now, he is a kind of a lesser known statue that stands in Lafayette Square. But he was a huge supporter of Manifest Destiny. And he said, it would seem that the white race alone received the divine command to subdue and replenish the earth. For it is the only race that has obeyed it, and the only race that hunts out new and distant lands, and even in the new world, to subdue and replenish it. He said that he calls Native Americans the red race, has disappeared from the Atlantic coast, and the tribes that resisted civilization met extinction. So ultimately, he's saying there was pretty much no one here when we got here, when Europeans landed, and then the people that were here and fought back, they either were civilized or they were murdered. So he is right. They were murdered in thousands, if not millions. And again, we have a statue up to Thomas Hart Benton. Controversial statues are, I think, could be debatable. In some instances, I don't think that there's a justification for having the Blair statue up or Thomas Hart Benton statue standing. As a historian and a person who works in the museum field, I do think that museums are the better place if you're going to have a statue up to put some context, because I know when I'm going walking or running, and I'm a history nerd, so I stop and read monuments oftentimes, but oftentimes I don't. And if I run past it as a person who's interested in history, I can imagine the person who could care less about history, how many times they stop and read the monuments. I would ask all of our people who are participating today, how many times have you stopped and read a monument or a sign that stood next to a monument? Most of you, it's probably never, or a handful of times. And so just putting a sign up that says, this great man, we have a statue here, he was also a racist and was a slaveholder or believed in Native American genocide or whatever the case may be, that's not enough. I think it really takes taking those statues down, putting them into museums so that you have professional museum audiences that can then contextualize those things and ask, like an art piece, you can ask, who was the creator? Why was this put up? When was this put up? What was the time period in the context? I am hesitant to say we should destroy these monuments because, again, they can be teaching tools of a snapshot of what Americans thought at different times, but they can be amazing teaching tools, again, to talk about white supremacy, to talk about genocide, to talk about to kind of unpack these historical traumas to create more of a healing session. We can say this was once up in Tower Grove Park. This was once up in Forrest Park. This was once up in Lafayette Square, but now they're here. Let's talk about them. Where where were we in the 1800s when this was put up, where we were in the 1900s when this was put up, and where are we today? What does this mean to, if you're an immigrant from coming to the United States, what does this monument mean to you? If you're an Indigenous American, what does this monument mean to you? If you're part of the Latinx community, what does this monument mean to you? If you are African American, what does this monument mean to you? So I think that those statues and monuments should be, many of them should be taken down to be placed in that better context. The Gateway Arch, I think, is fortunately the National Park Service has that and has interpreters that can interpret what the Gateway Arch Museum is about. But the Gateway Arch in general, I think, could be problematic because, again, it's a monument to manifest destiny and to opening the West up to westward expansion, which means genocide and removal of Native people from their lands. The Thomas Jefferson statue at the Missouri History Museum, it just says Thomas Jefferson. There's no when I work there. So bringing context to these artifacts, to these places, and having professional museum staff that are there to talk about them, to discuss them, to unpack them, and not hiding our history, not hiding behind the terrible things that our forefathers and foremothers did, but also educating people. And I understand that it's going to be hard because our generation and back were miseducated. Actually, I have a book in front of me right here. This is a Virginia textbook from the 1950s or 60s, I believe. And it talks about slavery being a benevolent good. It talks about Native Americans sitting down with Europeans and having a good old feast. This other textbook is from Georgia from the 1920s. It talks about the Ku Klux Klan being heroes and helping people out and bringing food. So we're battling not only people's history that they think that maybe their grandmother taught them, but you're battling history of people that your grandmother not only told you this, your parents not only told you learned about this probably in church, your schools, your teachers told you about this. So everyone in your community has told you that Thomas Jefferson or Thomas Hart Benton or Frank Blair or whoever these people are were, or Christopher Columbus were these intrepid people who did these great things. And now you're saying, people of color are now saying these are awful people, tear their statues down. You're creating this cognitive dissonance. And that's where that pushback comes from. So we have to be able to not just call our white counterparts who may find these statues to be very meaningful to them racist, but we have to bring them into the fold and help re-educate them and not tell them, okay, your grandma was a liar, but help re-educate them and say, hey, these are the facts. This is what Columbus did. This is what these slaveholders did. These are what these individuals stood for. So we're not against your grandmother. We're not against your ancestry, but we do need to have a community conversation around, do we promote do we want to promote white supremacy? And if so, then we need to have a discussion about why we want to do that. And if not, then how we can better reinterpret these objects, these monuments.
Thank you so much for that. And someone in the chat said, thank you for the perspective on the St. Louis Arch. And just want to remind the audience, I can't see, but we have a Q&A in case anyone has a question that pops up. Please go ahead and add that and we'll address those questions at the end of the session or towards the end of the session. Something that you said that stuck out for me is one of the arguments I heard a lot was removing the statues will erase history. And what you're saying is removing the statues and placing them in a museum and adding contextual history will actually promote a true history where we'll be able to have some of those more difficult conversations about the hard lessons that we've learned in history, what these people meant in multiple perspectives. And to me, that sounds like that would be a good reply to individuals who are nervous that it's actually going to erase history. But we don't know where these statues will go unless park services or individual areas are able to say, like, do they have a place to, is there a museum that we can put this in? Do we have museums created for that purpose yet? And what are the efforts?
That's very true. But I love when people say that it's going to erase history, because one, in 1776, the citizens of New York pulled down a statue of King George that stood in New York City. I don't think anyone knows who lost the American. Well, I think most people know who won the American Revolution. We're not like, oh, we're still a British colony. We know who won. The statue's gone, but we still know it was the U.S. or the colonies versus Great Britain. However, here in St. Louis, in the 1850s, we destroyed a Native American monument. The largest mound of the Mississippian Indians in the country was located, that we know of, was located right here in downtown St. Louis. So we have no problem destroying monuments and religious sites for Black and Brown people, Indigenous individuals and our Latinx brothers and sisters. I guarantee you, if you traveled across the country, there are probably thousands, if not millions, of religious sites that were once Native American land that are no longer there. We're still to this day building pipelines and disrupting burial grounds and sacred sites because we can, because we have the money to. So we don't care about destroying not only historic sites and monuments, but religious sites when it comes to our Indigenous brothers and sisters. But we do when it comes to a memorial or a monument that was built to white supremacy in the 19th or 20th century. So we have to get our priorities correct and understand American history has been one since our founding of taking down monuments, and also whose monuments do we support and whose monuments do we not.
Absolutely. Alyssa, do you have any follow-up to any of that?
No, I mean, I think that's really well stated, and certainly an argument that I see come up so much is like, it's erasing history, but what's really erasing history is leaving people out of textbooks that we use for children. But a lot of people don't know how curriculums get made, or these big books that end up with public schools, these textbooks that are like, when I was doing the research on the Texas history book, Texas actually sets a lot of standards for the rest of the US because they publish, or they need so many textbooks for their schools that a lot of publishing companies will cater to Texas standards for curriculum. And so I think that's important to understand how that system also works when we're talking about erasing history.
So we had a question. I'm going to go ahead and say it. So if any panelists would be willing to discuss Henry Shaw, the neighborhood, Tower Grove Park, the Botanical Gardens, and his history with slavery, I would love to hear your thoughts. I can speak to Tower Grove Park and Henry Shaw a little bit, but Marvin, if you know more about Henry Shaw's history with slavery, do you happen to want to answer that? And I can talk a little bit more about like the statue as well.
I'm not as, I know he was an enslaver of people. I've been to the site a little bit. Unfortunately, I think the site manager of the historic site there is trying to do a better job of interpreting the history of the enslaved community there. Again, I don't know. I'm not as familiar with that particular site and the history there, but he was an enslaver. I don't exactly know how many people he enslaved. So I can't really speak too much on Henry Shaw himself.
Yeah, I can't speak on Henry Shaw himself being a slave owner. Mine's specific with Henry Shaw and his creation of the parks and the Botanical Garden and the Christopher Columbus statue, which I can go into a little bit about the commission. But I will say that the land that he donated to be the Tower Grove Park was ancestral land of the Osage Nation. And I always want to lead with that, because when I first started thinking about the Columbus statue, I was like, well, my first thought was, where did this land come from? Because everything I read was, this is Henry Shaw's land. And I was like, no, but before that, how did he acquire this land? I think that's really important. And there's not a lot of literature on how the land specifically was acquired by each individual in St. Louis. and some land was given. Some people, they just wanted people to move here, so they gave them that land, and it became part of their generational history of land ownership. But Henry Shaw in the Tower Grove Park, the Columbus statue was the last statue that he wanted commissioned, and it was, I believe in 1886. Yes, 1886. It cost $5,000. It was created by Ferdinand von Miller. Ferdinand, who was the sculptor, he actually created many controversial statues in other parts of the country, including J. Marion Sims, who for some is known as the father of modern gynecology, whereas for others, he was known as a mad scientist who performed experiments without anesthesia on enslaved African women. So that just shows that even the sculptor of the Tower Grove Christopher Columbus statue was a controversial person if he was also making some of these other statues of controversial people, in my opinion. The commission was created, the one that I was on in 2017, and we came to the table to talk about what should we do with the statue. But unfortunately, it didn't seem like that was actually what was going to be happening, the removal of the statue, because the Missouri Alliance for Historic Preservation was very clear, saying that if the statue was removed, then Tower Grove Park would lose its historical preservation status. So that was one of the reasons why it wasn't removed and why the statue was maintained for so long in Tower Grove Park. Which goes back to systemic racism. Are the parks even able to remove some of these statues, or do we have to go level policy levels to say who's on these boards of Missouri Alliance for Preservation Office? Is it Black, Indigenous, people of color, or are they all people who are appointed by some other entity? So if you have more specific questions for that, please add to the Q&A.
Lindsey, for Shaw himself, I think I'm definitely not a person that would say like the botanical gardens and like should shut down and like because Shaw was a racist, and but I think that it's important for organizations like the Missouri Botanical Gardens to then to take that history and put it into context. They're doing that out east at James Madison's Montpelier. James Madison, the President of the United States, and he owned hundreds of enslaved individuals, and they've taken their site and reinterpreted it. So when you first get there, the first thing you get is that enslaved person's experience. And it's not just like you walk through one house, but half the experience is from that enslaved person's perspective. And they're really working with what they call the descendant community. So African Americans who can either trace their lineage back to Montpelier, or African Americans who from that community who can trace their lineage back to enslavement. And I think that's a really great model, not just for African Americans, but looking for Indigenous communities, saying like we want to create a descendants project here at whatever organization you're working for, to get that input, and not just tokenism saying, hey, we have our one Native American, we have our one Black person, we have our one Latinx person. Cool, check. And we're not actually going to listen, but actually having them on your board, making sure that they are, that people are actually listening, and you're really making those changes that can actually deeply impact the community.
Alyssa, do you have anything to add for that?
I think that's just such a good point to bring up about board representation, because St. Louis has more nonprofits per capita than most other cities our size. And yet who are on the boards? Like, it does still tend to be mostly older white males. And yet they are the ones who are representing our social service systems. And I think when bringing up J. Marion Sims, it's important to remember that there was also a medical school here that was named after him. And these legacies, they continue on, and St. Louis has such a high Black maternal and infant death rate that it's just so high, and these things have legacies that continue to impact us. And these statues aren't helping us with the legacies that we have now. If anything, it's erasing people's lived experiences by hiding the truth.
So we have a question, two questions in the Q&A. I read an essay that suggested putting the statues in a park or field, then allow them to slowly fade with no upkeep, but have signage describing the history and why they were removed. So we sort of hit on this, like moving the statues from where they currently are, adding signage to them, but in this particular case, saying the statues will slowly sort of fade away. And then another question, St. Louis County and City of Clayton have both recently announced plans to review their memorial landscapes to assess their consistency with commitments to equal justice. What advice would you give to these working groups? For example, about questions they should ask and inclusive processes to use so that these efforts are most impactful. I'll say that these efforts have been happening for a very long time in certain areas of the country. And I would say look at some of those and where were the gaps with that. For Tower Grove Park, decades of American Indians have stood at that table advocating for it very peacefully, sharing their traumatic histories, sharing their experiences, and in a way being tokenized. So I would say making sure that you're not just tokenizing people whenever you are having these memorial committees, because that is one of the most common thing that happens. Like, oh, we want to change, we want equity, racial justice, so we need to have a certain number of this type of people there. But what really happens as someone who's been in that circle is that I was extremely tokenized and only wanted my native perspective on what I thought of America, whereas I'm also a researcher and very objective in the way that I do research. And none of the research I had brought forward was allowed to be aired, whereas they really just wanted my experience with something else. So respecting people as their whole entity and understanding that each person, each community, each tribe has its own perspective about statues and mascots and everything. And what is best for the community is understanding and admitting that you've been racist and that we live in a racist society. And until we're able to admit some of those things, I think that's the first step, is saying we're going to be doing this out of love and solidarity, not saying we're doing this for equity, but saying this is an act of solidarity. We welcome you to the table to make these changes. Anyone else have anything to add to that?
I would definitely just say yes, amen, Lindsay. And I actually had a question for Alyssa about, like, when it comes to like healing, and because a lot of these monuments or statues, when they're pulled down and people get in their feelings about like, oh, this has been up since I was a child, or like my grandmother or my parents brought me here when I was a kid, and so like the first, I think, kind of like addressing trauma, like the first thing you have to do, if I'm correct, Alyssa, is like admit you have a problem. So you can't be like, oh, this, like, we want racial equity, so let's hold hands with our Black and Indigenous brothers and sisters and sing Kumbaya, but being like, no, I have a problem. I need to address it.
Mm-hmm. And committing to making those.
Yeah, it's not about being on social media and putting up a black square because George Floyd was murdered and then not doing anything else. And it's not just about pulling down the monuments, because those monuments are a symbol of white supremacy. They are not white supremacy themselves. It's our mindset. It's our actions. That is white supremacy. And so to the person who asked that awesome question, I would say, one, yes to what Lindsay said, and then also digging deep internally. And it's okay to mess up. It's okay to be like, oops, I stumbled. We're all going to do something offensive at one point in time in our lives or another, and it's okay. But once a Black, Indigenous, or person of color comes and says, hey, you messed up, you don't need to get defensive and say, like, no, but but like, I'm not racist. It's okay. Like, it's okay. You messed up. Don't double down. Just, it's okay. And then we can work through it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so for the question, and then I'll address your question, Marvin, I would say like go to the community and get the people that are hard to find. It might take extra effort because you don't automatically know the people who are missing from the table, but after you look around the table and see who's missing, then you have to put in effort to find them and to include them. And as far as trauma and healing, I think there's some debate about how racism is classified within, like, is it a psychological issue? Does that excuse people's behavior? There's a lot of discussion around that. But as far as healing, I think community, like, we have to listen to the communities. And so first, especially like with this, the circle that we held around the Columbus statue, that was very community led. It was what several generations of folks needed at the time to feel like they could continue to move on and do the work in other places. And as far, it's really difficult because when we're confronted with our own racism, it can be really easy to just like shut down and go, especially for like well-meaning white people generally, and other lighter skinned people of color, is you head into this shame hole where like there's no reaching that person, and they're going to just instead beat themselves up. And so it's really, like Lindsey said, like we need to come at these conversations from love and solidarity, so that way we can really have those conversations and be able to keep making meaningful change, knowing that this history is built up over centuries and it's going to take time, but that doesn't mean that we have the excuse to not work on it now, because it will take time. We need to do what we can to make change now for the future.
Yes. And there's another question. What, if any, programming was there surrounding the removal of the Christopher Columbus statue? So I think I hit on this. They did develop a commission for the removal, and they had Italian Americans represented, American Indians, one representative from Black Lives Matter movement, and then other members who were from St. Louis, I think, History Museum, the Arch, a few other places. So it was a group of about 10 people, and someone who was from the actual larger commission, Tower Grove Commission, who came to listen. And there were a few sessions. But the process was facilitated by a white individual, and I think that that was problematic. So having someone who's facilitating being a person of color, I think is important, because then it's less about tokenizing certain people and not tokenizing other people, and one group sharing their experiences with the other so the other group understands. So that sort of happened within that. But the reason that the Tower Grove statue was removed was not, they had plenty of opportunity to remove the statue for decades now, because we were many community members had said that they wanted it, but they had their own agenda and things that they had to do. So Missouri Alliance for Preservation, they had to make sure that they were happy, and they also had to make sure that some of their members who donate to the Tower Grove Park were also happy, because if you're removing a statue, you're not going to get as much funding from certain people who disagree with what you're saying. And so you have to be strategic if you are going to remove a monument or something like that, where you are being honest about why you are doing it, and it's not to erase it, and also being honest what you're going to do with the statue and what your plans are. And I think that that was something that was lacking with Tower Grove Park, is that they had an immense amount of support from Native community here locally who have helped. But the statue was removed because of George Floyd's murder and the pressure that the Black Lives Matter put on the statue to be removed physically. And so they had made a choice to keep the statue up, but then remove it whenever it best fitted them. And so going forward, I hope that committees actually are listening to the Native groups of people who want these statues removed, and listen to their ideas of what to replace the statue with, and bring it together within the community. So hopefully, one of the questions I had on here, I don't think we have time to to talk about is what you would replace. Many individuals are curious what it should be replaced with, the Tower Grove Christopher Columbus statue. So does anyone have any final thoughts about the statue?
I think you and I tweeted back and forth about, it was an image of 3 Indigenous women. I think it was from Michigan. I don't know. Forgive me. I don't know what ethnic group or tribe they were from. But 2 women were on the sides of this whatever. I don't know what monument it was, but the 2 women were on the side, and 1 woman was on the top on the pedestal. I thought it was a beautiful, even though they were humans and they were, but I thought it was a beautiful like space. And so one of the ideas, I was like, that could just be a performance space where people could, like, the community can come and gather and do spoken word or have ceremonies or whatever to kind of give back. Another idea would be to give it back, allow the First Nation people, our Indigenous brothers and sisters, to decide what goes there. The land was theirs, and so while I would love to have a statue of a former enslaved person or enslaved person there, again, our ancestors were brought here after and placed on land that wasn't theirs either, and so again, I would love it to be a community effort to think about, but definitely leaning on our Indigenous brothers and sisters to figure out what would be the most helpful and most meaningful for that community.
Very much agree. Whatever ends up up there next, I think it should be community led and with a lot of transparency, and not in the case of Henry Shaw, one white man who owned the land, who said, "I want this to go here." I'm guessing he probably didn't really consult with the Italian Americans there at the time. And I don't know, like, as an Italian, like, I don't know that I would want to be represented by somebody with this legacy. So I think, again, consulting with community members, so that way it is a space for all and not just, not like a warning sign or a symbol of white supremacy. So.
I'll also say maybe just a water fountain or something that's, separately, that's separate than that. But also, I think it's important to keep that history, like Marvin, you were saying about having these statues in a museum. I would definitely go to a museum that was dedicated to racist statues just to learn about them and learn about the people who made it happen, that they were removed, because we are a part of history now. And those efforts deserve to be brought forward and be put into future history books, because we are a community, regardless of our perspectives. We all live together and come from similar backgrounds. So I think we need to probably end for now. And I think maybe Kristen Kristen may have some final thoughts for everyone, but I just want to thank you, Alyssa and Marvin, for your conversation today, and for everyone who was able to come and view it today. Thank you all so much. And please reach out to us. I think our contact information may be available, and just feel free to reach out to us.
Thank you, Lindsay.
I'll just close real quickly. I'm Josh Stuhlin. I'm with the Pulitzer Arts Foundation, and let you know that we have an entire series of programming still taking place. Tomorrow, actually, the workshop is full as of a few minutes ago, but a podcast was just released with Madad, which is Dee Nichols, Mallory Nizam, and Damon Davis. You can find out more information on our website about the Monument Lab programs, and then our keynote conversation that happened last night in this panel discussion will be released at some point. So for those people who weren't able to watch today or couldn't attend for the whole session, you'll be able to get that information at a later date. But thank you so much to Lindsay, Alyssa, and Marvin for their time today. Really appreciated, and we look forward to continuing these conversations. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.